Welcome, dear subscribers and curious listeners of my channel. When people talk about Hogwarts, they usually think first of Gryffindor and Slytherin, the two houses that always seem to take center stage. Gryffindors are known for bravery, Slytherins for ambition, Hufflepuffs for loyalty and hard work, and Ravenclaws for intellect. But despite Ravenclaw's reputation for wisdom, the house hasn't always been represented by the wisest decisions. Luna Lovegood is perhaps the only Ravenclaw most people remember, and more for her eccentricity than logic. But what if we take a closer look at other students and graduates of this house? Today we'll examine 5 cases where Ravenclaws behaved in ways that were anything but rational. Enjoy the watching. Number 1. Gilderoy Lockhart, a master of deception, but not of reason. Among all the characters in the Harry Potter series, Gilderoy Lockhart might be the most absurd Ravenclaw. His rise to fame had nothing to do with intellect. He simply stole others' achievements and erased the memories of real heroes. The result? Best-selling books and swarms of adoring witches. But then, inexplicably, he accepted a teaching position at Hogwarts, and here's the big question: why? He knowingly entered an environment where his incompetence could, and did, get exposed within days. And that's exactly what happened. Students quickly saw through him. At the end of the second year, when Harry and Ron caught him trying to flee, Lockhart foolishly revealed the truth. Just before attempting to erase their memories, the spell backfired. His plan failed. So did his career. Number 2. Marietta Edgecomb, betrayal in the name of reason. When Harry founded Dumbledore's army and the secret student group learning real defense against the dark arts, he probably didn't expect a traitor among them. Marietta Edgecomb, a Ravenclaw and Cho Chang's friend, reported them to Umbridge. Fear is understandable. She could have simply chosen not to join, but she not only betrayed the group, she betrayed her best friend. As a result, Hermione's jinx left her with boils spelling out the word sneak across her face. A truly smart person would have found a more careful way out of a tough situation. But Marietta, a student of Ravenclaw, showed panic, cowardice, and short-sightedness, not strategy. Number 3. Helena Ravenclaw, a secret given to a stranger. Helena, daughter of Rowena Ravenclaw and known as the Grey Lady, once stole her mother's enchanted diadem, an artifact meant to enhance wisdom. She fled, hid it in a forest, and eventually died at the hands of the Bloody Baron, who loved her. Centuries later, Tom Riddle, a Slytherin student, tracked down Helena's ghost, and she told him where the diadem was hidden. Not a Ravenclaw, not a teacher, not even a friend, but a charming, charismatic young man whose intentions she should have seen straight through. How could she not sense who Tom really was? Why entrust such a powerful secret to him? Where was her much-vaunted Ravenclaw foresight? Number 4. Xenophilius Lovegood, betrayed for his daughter, and logic didn't follow. Xenophilius Lovegood, eccentric publisher of The Quibbler and vocal opponent of Voldemort. His daughter, Luna, is one of Ravenclaw's most admirable representatives, but when faced with a choice between his daughter and his principles, he chose betrayal. When Harry, Ron, and Hermione came seeking help, Xenophilius tried to hand them over to the Death Eaters, hoping they'd return Luna. Of course, the plan failed, but even in theory, what would have happened next? Would they really give her back or just kill everyone? You could argue it was a father's desperate act, but from a logical standpoint, Xenophilius chose a foolish, hopeless, and dangerous path. Number 5. Professor Quirrell, sought power, found ruin. Professor Quirrell was once an ordinary, awkward Ravenclaw, often the butt of jokes. Eager to prove himself, he went in search of great power and knowledge. The result? Possession by Voldemort, partnership with the Dark Lord, and Voldemort's face on the back of his head. Quirrell spent an entire school year walking the halls of Hogwarts, hiding the greatest evil under a turban. He allowed himself to become a puppet. And for what? Power he couldn't control? Influence he hadn't earned? Wouldn't a true Ravenclaw someone with intellect, critical thinking, and a thirst for understanding, have seen where this path led? Number 6. Penelope Clearwater, dating Percy and overlooking his ministry obsession. Penelope Clearwater had the brains. As a top Ravenclaw and a prefect, she was known for her insight and composure. But when she fell for Percy Weasley, she failed to see the one thing everyone else eventually did, his blind obedience. By the 5th book, Percy had broken ties with his family, siding entirely with the ministry. He called Dumbledore dangerous and refused to speak to Ron. "The ministry is simply trying to protect us all," he wrote in a letter, as if that justified turning his back on truth. Penelope, of all people, should have seen the signs. Percy's loyalty was never to people, only to structure and approval. His obsession with climbing the ministry ladder blinded him to reality and to the suffering around him. If Penelope truly understood him, why didn't she speak up or step away? Instead, she stayed silent, watching him drift further from what mattered. For a Ravenclaw known for clarity and critical thinking, it was a painful lapse. Not all mistakes allowed, some unfold quietly in moments when someone smart chooses not to see. Number 7, Michael Corner, arguing with Ginny after a Quidditch match. Michael Corner should have known better. Ravenclaws are meant to think before they speak, but after Gryffindor beat Ravenclaw in Quidditch, he let his pride speak louder than reason. Ginny Weasley scored the winning goal, the crowd roared, and instead of celebrating her moment, Michael sulked. "He got all sulky when I beat him," Ginny told Ron later, "so I ditched him and went out with Dean instead." In that single match, Michael lost the game and the girl. It wasn't just jealousy, it was bad judgment. Instead of cheering for Ginny, he argued with her about fouls and fairness. It was petty, it was emotional, and it was the opposite of what Ravenclaws stand for. Ginny, fierce and self-assured, didn't wait around for apologies. Michael learned the hard way. Intelligence without emotional maturity doesn't win hearts. Or Quidditch cups. Number 8, Roger Davies being pushy with Fleur Delacour. Roger Davies walked into the Yule Ball with confidence. As Ravenclaw Quidditch captain, he was used to attention, and he had the most dazzling date in the room. Fleur Delacour, part Vila, champion of Beauxbaton, glided beside him like a figure from a dream. But Roger misunderstood the nature of charm. Fleur had agreed to go with him, yes, but she didn't ask to be followed all night, peppered with questions and clung to like a prize. "He's a little, how you say, noisy," Fleur later told a friend with a raised eyebrow. It wasn't just awkward, it was careless. Ravenclaws pride themselves on reading the room, understanding nuance. Roger ignored every cue. He laughed too loudly, stood too close, and by midnight Fleur had disappeared to the other side of the hall. Even Madame Maxime seemed unimpressed. Strategic thinking on the pitch didn't translate to grace in social settings. That night, Roger Davies didn't just strike out with Fleur, he embarrassed himself in front of 3 schools. And for Ravenclaw, it was a moment where brilliance gave way to blind arrogance. Number 9, Terry Boot, trying to curse Draco on the Hogwarts Express. Terry Boot lost his temper. That in itself was surprising. Ravenclaws were known for measured decisions, cool logic, and thinking 5 moves ahead. But when he spotted Draco Malfoy smirking in the Hogwarts Express corridor, bragging about something cruel he'd said to a first year, Terry didn't hesitate. He raised his wand and fired a hex. It missed. Malfoy ducked and shouted for help. Within minutes, Slughorn and 2 prefects dragged Terry off the train. "He attacked me unprovoked," Draco sneered. "Typical. They pretend to be smarter than us, but look at this." The real mistake wasn't the spell, it was choosing Malfoy. Everyone knew his family ties. Lucius Malfoy had just been broken out of Azkaban. His mother had been seen whispering with Snape. By 6th year, even the walls of Hogwarts echoed with fear. Ravenclaws should have known better than anyone. Some battles aren't worth starting. Terry's stunt gave Malfoy ammunition. Slytherins began spreading the rumour that Ravenclaws were cracking under pressure, acting like reckless Gryffindors. There's no glory in swinging your wand without thinking. Terry's pride burned more than any punishment he got. He spent a week in detention and never spoke of it again. But the damage lingered, not just to his reputation, but to Ravenclaw's image. Intelligence without restraint is just another form of foolishness. And that day, Terry Boot proved even the sharpest minds can be dulled by emotion. Number 10. Luna Lovegood, falling for a trap in the Forbidden Forest. Luna Lovegood had always danced to a rhythm only she could hear. While others read spellbooks, she read the Quibbler. While others chased Quidditch glory, she searched for crumple-horned Snorkax. But in her 6th year, Luna's free spirit led her into real danger. One evening, she slipped into the Forbidden Forest, convinced she'd spotted signs of a creature only she believed existed. "I think they nest in moonlight," she had whispered to Ginny days before, eyes glowing with wonder. But the Forbidden Forest was no place for wonder. Thestrals, centaurs, and worse creatures watched from the shadows. Even Hagrid, half-giant and forest-savvy, approached it with caution. Luna walked in alone. She left no note, no plan. It was sheer luck that Neville, searching for missing students that evening, saw her shoes near the forest edge and raised the alarm. Professor Sprout sent help just in time. Luna had wandered deep enough to hear the hooves of centaurs and the growls of something far less friendly. For someone in Ravenclaw, a house that prizes wisdom and critical thought, Luna's decision didn't reflect either. Curiosity is a virtue, but without judgment, it becomes a danger. Luna's brilliance lay in her ability to see beyond what others accepted, but brilliance must be tempered with caution. "She sees things differently," Hermione once said. "That's not always a bad thing. But when your difference leads you into mortal peril, it stops being charming." Luna's heart was brave, her imagination boundless, but that night in the forest she learned a lesson Ravenclaws should never forget. Knowledge isn't just about discovering new things. Sometimes it's knowing when not to chase them. Number 11. Cho Chang, staying friends with Marietta after the betrayal. Cho Chang had every reason to draw the line. Marietta Edgecomb didn't just make a mistake, she betrayed Dumbledore's army, exposed the Room of Requirement, and nearly got them all expelled. Her name appeared in festering boils across her face, spelled there by Hermione's clever curse. Sneak! The whole school saw it. No one could look at her the same again, but Cho did. Even after the betrayal, she defended her. "She didn't mean to," Cho said. "She was just scared." That defense rang hollow. Fear explains a lot, but it doesn't excuse everything, especially not in wartime. The DA wasn't just a club, it was resistance. Harry risked everything to train them. Neville stood with a broken nose. Ginny hexed Malfoy with a bat bogey charm that left him sobbing. And Marietta, one trip to Umbridge's office and she cracked. For Cho to continue calling her a friend, especially so soon, revealed a side of her judgment that didn't belong to Ravenclaw's legacy of reason. Even Hermione, cool and calculating, couldn't understand Cho's loyalty. "She betrayed us," she snapped. "She betrayed you." But Cho didn't budge. Her heart pulled harder than her head. She turned away from Harry too after he refused to forgive Marietta. "You don't understand," she cried. And maybe he didn't, but Cho, for all her beauty and intelligence, proved something that night. She could not separate emotion from consequence. In Ravenclaw, where wisdom is supposed to guide loyalty, Cho's decision cut deep. Friendship is a choice, and when that choice keeps you standing beside someone who nearly destroyed the very thing you believed in, it stops being noble. It becomes blindness. In defending Marietta, Cho didn't just misread the moment, she misread the battlefield. Number 12. Anthony Goldstein underprepared for the battle at the Department of Mysteries. Anthony Goldstein had every reason to be prepared. As a member of Dumbledore's army, he had trained alongside Harry, Hermione, and Ron. He'd mastered the stunning spell, learned defensive techniques, and practiced late into the evening hours in the Room of Requirement. Yet when the night came, when Harry's vision pulled them into the Ministry of Magic and led them straight into the Department of Mysteries, Anthony was not ready. "We've got to get out of here," he shouted, but his hands shook and his spells missed their targets. Neville, bleeding and barely able to speak, stood his ground longer than Anthony did. The chaos in the Hall of Prophecies demanded quick thinking and nerves of steel. But when Death Eaters descended in black robes and silver masks, Anthony hesitated. While Ginny and Luna flanked Harry, deflecting curses with precision, Anthony lost his wand mid-duel. Dolohov struck him across the chest with a non-verbal curse, sending him flying. "Get up!" Hermione yelled. But Anthony crawled to safety instead. Even Luna, known for her dreamy detachment, showed more composure in battle. Ravenclaws are taught to prize intellect, but wisdom is more than facts. It's knowing how and when to act. Anthony had the knowledge, he had the spells. What he lacked was resolve under pressure. "He panicked," Ron later said. "We needed every wand we had, and he just froze." It wasn't cruelty, just truth. The boy who once corrected Professor Binns during a lecture on goblin rebellions now failed to think in the heat of war. It would be unfair to blame Anthony alone. Even Harry admitted afterward, "We weren't ready for that." But the point stands. Battle is not an exam. You can't revise your way through a Death Eater ambush. And for someone from Ravenclaw, the house of cool logic and sharp minds, Anthony Goldstein's performance in the Department of Mysteries was a painful reminder. Theory means nothing without courage to act. Number 13, Cho Chang, dating Harry without processing her grief. Cho Chang had always been regarded as one of Ravenclaw's most promising students. Known for her academic precision, calm demeanor, and effortless charm on the Quidditch pitch, she seemed to embody everything her house prized: intelligence, wit, and wisdom. Yet in the aftermath of one of the most harrowing events in her life, the sudden and brutal death of Cedric Diggory, Cho made a decision that defied the very intellectual principles her house upheld. She began dating Harry Potter, the boy who had returned from the Triwizard Tournament, clutching Cedric's lifeless body. It was not that Cho's choice was unforgivable, nor was her pain unfounded. Cedric had died unjustly, murdered in a graveyard by Lord Voldemort. Harry had witnessed it, had survived the encounter that Cedric could not. But the timing and reasoning behind her romantic shift toward Harry suggest not a calculated move of the mind, but a spontaneous reaction driven by grief and emotional confusion. In Order of the Phoenix, Cho appears beside Harry in Dumbledore's army meetings, her interest in him growing in the quiet shadows of the Room of Requirement. But beneath that attraction festered something unresolved, an emotional wound that had never been allowed to scab. Ravenclaws at their best are rational thinkers. They analyze before they act, and they value clarity of mind. But Cho in this instance did not pause to reflect on her own needs before diving headfirst into a complicated entanglement. It was not a question of whether she liked Harry, perhaps she did, but whether she was in the right place to offer or receive affection. Her relationship with Cedric had been real, and their time together had carried the thrill of young love. The suddenness of its end left her bereft, not just of a boyfriend, but of a sense of safety and control. Rather than address that loss, Cho turned to Harry, the only person who could understand a piece of what she had witnessed. But understanding is not a foundation for romance, it is a bridge for healing. Unfortunately, Cho mistook the bridge for a destination. In one of the most telling scenes of Order of the Phoenix, during their ill-fated Valentine's date at Madame Puddifoot's tea shop, the contrast between them becomes painfully clear. Cho is overwhelmed by grief, suddenly bursting into tears over the mention of Cedric, while Harry grows increasingly uncomfortable, unable to balance empathy with the pressure of new affection. The entire encounter descends into awkward silence and confusion. "She accused me of going out with Hermione," Harry later tells Ron and Hermione, bewildered by the emotional outburst he hadn't expected. Cho's jealousy, surfacing in the middle of a date meant to foster new feelings, signaled that she had not truly processed her mourning. It wasn't fair to Harry, nor to herself. The weight of unresolved trauma loomed over every interaction, distorting the sincerity of their connection. For someone from Ravenclaw, a house that values introspection and learning, Cho's impulsiveness was striking. Instead of turning inward, examining her pain, and working through it with the tools Ravenclaws are meant to refine, she sought an external solution. In psychology, it is often said that people in grief sometimes pursue new relationships to escape the emotional void left behind. It is not malicious, but it is misguided. Cho's attempt to bypass her grief by attaching herself to someone else, especially someone so intricately tied to Cedric's death, was a gamble with little chance of success. Her behavior in the aftermath only compounded this misstep. When questioned about her loyalties after the betrayal of the DA by Marietta Edgecomb, Cho defended her friend, even as Marietta had exposed their secret group to Dolores Umbridge. "She's a lovely person, really," Cho insisted, but such misplaced loyalty further alienated her from Harry, who viewed the betrayal as a matter of principle, not personal affection. This moment revealed another dimension of Cho's irrationality, the inability to separate emotional bonds from ethical decisions. In Ravenclaw, logic is not merely a school subject, it is a code of conduct. To act without clear thought, especially when the stakes involve danger, secrecy, and trust, undermines the very ideals of the house. Cho's decision to excuse Marietta instead of confronting the betrayal with clarity further distanced her from the kind of decision-making Ravenclaws are known for. It is not that compassion and loyalty are faults, they are virtues, but when they cloud judgment, they become liabilities. Cho Chang's academic brilliance never faltered, but emotional intelligence is a different kind of wisdom, one not taught in textbooks or tested through essays. In the heat of personal tragedy, she failed to apply the same rigor to her heart that she had always applied to her studies. She rushed towards something that seemed like comfort, but found only more pain. Her dates with Harry were overshadowed by silences she didn't know how to break and tears she couldn't explain. Harry, kind and brave though he was, could not be Cedric's replacement. And Cho, though perhaps aware of that, could not stop herself from wishing he could be. Her brief romance with Harry was not a shameful act, but it was a misplaced one. In many ways, Cho was searching for a way to keep Cedric close, not by remembering him, but by reaching out to the last person who had seen him alive. It was less about Harry as a person, and more about Harry as a symbol. Symbols are powerful, but they cannot reciprocate love. What Cho needed was time, solitude, and reflection, things Ravenclaws typically embrace. But instead she walked into a mirror maze of emotions without a map. There's a reason why their relationship never developed beyond that initial attraction. They lacked the emotional compatibility to sustain it. Harry was still grappling with his own trauma, Voldemort's return, the Ministry's denial of truth, the weight of being the chosen one. He needed support, not confusion. Cho, trapped in mourning, needed gentleness and space, not a new romantic entanglement. Together they were like two broken compasses, spinning in opposite directions. Number 14, Professor Flitwick, failing to notice Draco's secret activities. Professor Phileas Flitwick was not a man easily fooled. Known for his diminutive stature, his excitable energy, and above all, his commanding expertise in charms, he had earned the respect of every student and teacher who walked the stone halls of Hogwarts. Yet, in the chaos that surrounded the school during Harry Potter's 6th year, even a mind as sharp as his faltered. Flitwick, the head of Ravenclaw House, who embodied the house's devotion to wit, wisdom, and careful analysis, once misjudged a situation so gravely that the entire castle paid the price. It was the year Draco Malfoy began to slip through shadows. He grew paler, more reserved and haunted. Professors whispered that he looked ill. Students speculated wildly. But while Professor Snape kept an unsettling eye on Draco, and while Harry Potter grew increasingly obsessed with tracking his behavior, Flitwick, with all his intellect and intuition, failed to probe beneath the surface. He allowed Draco to recede into secrecy, and in doing so, allowed something far darker to seep into the castle itself. Flitwick had always prided himself on his alertness. During classes, he noticed the slightest hesitation in a student's wand movement. He could detect when a charm lacked intent or when a child's mind wandered mid-spell. His classroom was a sanctuary of precision, but outside those walls, in the grander machinery of the school, he became strangely passive. He entrusted larger security concerns to Dumbledore, to McGonagall, even to Snape, a man whose loyalties were debated more often than rain fell in Scotland. And so, when the very foundation of the school's safety began to crack, Flitwick failed to notice. Draco's mission to repair the vanishing cabinet in the Room of Requirement, the hidden doorway that would allow Death Eaters to enter Hogwarts, went unchecked. Filch, the caretaker, grumbled about mysterious noises in the upper floors. Students whispered about Draco disappearing for hours. Even Trelawney was thrown out of the Room of Requirement one night. But Flitwick, focused on teaching, on his charming new curriculum, and on routine, did not act. A Ravenclaw would typically pride themselves on their capacity for deduction, but Flitwick, in an ironic twist, failed to deduce the pattern forming before his very eyes. When Katie Bell was cursed by a necklace intended for Dumbledore, it was a signal that danger was closer than the staff realized. Flitwick assisted with containment efforts, helped calm students, and reinforced magical protections. But even then he did not connect the chain of incidents to the frail, frantic boy in Slytherin robes who could barely meet anyone's gaze. Flitwick's trust in the system, in the collective defenses of the school, became his blind spot. He underestimated the possibility that one student, acting in secret, could breach layers of enchantments designed by centuries of magical genius. More crucially, he underestimated the desperation and resourcefulness of a 16-year-old operating under threat from Lord Voldemort himself. That underestimation became the flaw in Ravenclaw's crown. When the Death Eaters finally arrived inside Hogwarts, it was not through the front gates, nor through any means that the professors had prepared for. It was through the vanishing cabinet, restored and repurposed by Draco Malfoy. Professor Flitwick, like the others, was caught off guard. The defences he had so carefully enchanted were not directed inward. They had prepared for siege, not for infiltration, and therein lay the tragedy of misapplied intellect. During the Battle of the Astronomy Tower, Flitwick was seen dashing through corridors, fighting to protect students and staff. He was not a coward, nor was he weak. His dueling skills were exceptional. He helped repel the Death Eaters. But by the time he acted, the damage had been done. Dumbledore had already fallen. The castle had been violated, and Ravenclaw's brightest mind had failed to predict the storm brewing beneath their feet. Some wounds run too deep for the healing, the narration read after the battle. And though these words were not addressed to Flitwick, they could just as easily describe the quiet remorse that followed him in the weeks thereafter. He resumed teaching, of course. He smiled at students and performed his wand flourishes. But something had dimmed. A small but indelible dent in his confidence had taken hold. In truth, the responsibility was shared. The entire staff failed to anticipate the magnitude of the threat. But Flitwick's lapse was particularly jarring because he represented the very ideal of watchful wisdom. He had taught generations of witches and wizards to think critically, to observe carefully, and to act with precision. And yet, in the moment when it mattered most, he had overlooked the quiet cries of a troubled boy walking a dangerous path. Draco Malfoy was not especially cunning in hiding his burden. His behavior was erratic. He was openly distraught, frequently absent from meals, and trembled during class. Flitwick had noticed. He had even approached Draco once, after a lesson, asking gently if everything was all right. Draco had muttered something about being tired, and that was the end of it. The follow-up never came. The concern, though genuine, was fleeting. It's tempting to excuse the oversight as simple human error. But when it comes from a Ravenclaw professor who had lectured on vigilance and magical intuition, the mistake becomes emblematic. Flitwick's mind was brilliant, but at that moment it was compartmentalized, focused on academia, on spellcraft, on his duties within a structured system. It failed to perceive emotional distress as a potential security risk, and that ultimately was the failing. Number 15, Ravenclaw's failing, the common room riddle. The night was quiet over the towers of Hogwarts, and the sky above the Ravenclaw Tower shimmered with stars. Inside the vast expanse of the castle, the marble staircase stood still for once. But just outside the arched door to the Ravenclaw common room, under the silent gaze of a bronze eagle, 3 students stood unmoving, eyes narrowed, lips pursed, brows furrowed, not in concentration, but in mounting frustration. The eagle knocker had already posed its question, a characteristically clever riddle with an elegant twist of logic, and the answer had not come. The 3 Ravenclaws, Stephen Cornfoot, Morag McDougal, and Mandy Brocklehurst, stood in silence, defeated by the very thing that was supposed to define them. Which came first, the phoenix or the flame? The riddle was neither particularly obscure nor new. In fact, it had cycled through the eagle's repertoire many times over the years. And yet here they stood, unable to answer. Stephen Cornfoot, a wiry 6th year with a sharp face and often sharper tongue, had been the first to arrive. He was known in the arithmancy classroom for having a natural instinct for numbers and formulae, but riddles like this one, those that required paradoxical, creative reasoning, left him uneasy. He'd muttered a few guesses, each rebuffed with a quiet, mechanical, incorrect from the knocker. The door remained firmly shut. Morag arrived shortly after. Usually confident and incisive, her essays on the political structures of Goblin society were revered among the faculty. But this riddle threw her off balance. She tried applying Socratic reasoning, a touch of metaphysics and even a poetic interpretation, but the answer did not come. Mandy Brocklehurst, younger than the others, had simply stood back, hoping inspiration would strike. Unlike the other houses where entry required a password, Ravenclaw demanded thought. "You've got to answer a question," as Luna Lovegood once explained to Harry Potter. "If you get it wrong, you have to wait for someone who gets it right." And so they waited. They paced, they sighed, their minds churned, but the door remained sealed, mocking them with every passing second. The irony was too sharp to miss. These were not inattentive students. These were Ravenclaws, students selected for their intellect, for their curiosity, for the trait Rowena herself had prized above all, wisdom. And yet, their inability to solve a single riddle revealed something quietly unsettling about their house. Intelligence is not a constant flame. It flickers, and sometimes it dims when you need it most. For all their cleverness, they had failed. Not just to answer the riddle, but to represent what they were meant to be. Morag, ever the pragmatist, eventually leaned against the cold stone wall and said aloud, "We'll just wait." Her voice trembled, not from fear, but from a quiet erosion of pride. That was the most damning moment, not the wrong guesses, not the silence, but the surrender. In choosing to wait, these 3 bright minds gave up the very principle of Ravenclaw, to seek understanding, to think, to try. In that instant, the bronze eagle became more than a knocker. It became a mirror. It reflected not their intelligence, but their uncertainty. Ravenclaws like to imagine themselves above others, cleverer than Gryffindors, more refined than Slytherins, more nuanced than Hufflepuffs. But knowledge alone was not enough. The door demanded more than academic recall. It asked for intuition. It tested the student's ability to embrace paradox. "A circle has no beginning," someone once whispered, as the answer to that riddle. But tonight, no one had the courage to even try that answer. In Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, there is a brief mention of this strange practice. "You've got to answer a question," Luna says, almost dreamily, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. But in that same moment, we realize how often Ravenclaws fail. "What if you get it wrong?" Harry asks. "Then you have to wait for someone who gets it right," Luna replies. It seems whimsical, charming, but beneath that charm is a quiet indictment. What happens when no one gets it right? What happens when a line of Ravenclaws simply waits? Stephen's fingers traced the stone wall. He could recall complex enchantments by memory, had once solved a magical logic grid designed by Professor Vector, but he stood helpless now. His silence echoed louder than any wrong answer. He thought perhaps the question was a metaphor for life, or time, or magic itself, but none of the guesses satisfied the Bronze Guardian. They were not alone in this failure. In the long history of the Tower, countless Ravenclaws had stood where they stood now. Some had waited minutes, others hours. Some had given up and spent the night in the hallway, shivering under their cloaks. There were even stories of upperclassmen solving the riddle and smirking as they passed, the younger students muttering, "Think harder next time." That wasn't wisdom, that was cruelty wrapped in robes. There's a strange culture in Ravenclaw, unspoken but understood. If you can't solve the riddle, you are not worthy of the common room. It's an odd contrast to the house's reputation. A Gryffindor might break in, a Slytherin might find a back door, a Hufflepuff might knock again with kindness. But a Ravenclaw would stand in silence, ashamed, waiting for salvation in the form of someone cleverer. In that moment, Mandy remembered a time in her second year when Luna Lovegood had effortlessly answered a riddle about transfiguration that had stumped 4 prefects. Luna hadn't gloated. She had simply said, "Oh, I read that in the theoretical limitations of elemental transfiguration." The prefects had laughed, but Mandy had remembered. Luna didn't guess. She knew. And now, years later, Mandy stood frozen, knowing nothing. The door eventually opened. A fifth-year girl with ink-stained fingers and a sleepy look in her eyes approached, heard the riddle, and smiled. "The phoenix rises from the ashes. The flame creates the phoenix, but the phoenix gives birth to the flame. They come together." The door creaked open. She entered without another word. Number 16. Padma Patil, letting Ron ruin her Yule Ball. At the heart of Hogwarts, the House of Ravenclaw stood as a sanctuary of intellect, wisdom, and insight. Yet even among those prized for their clarity of mind, there are moments when judgment falters, not in complex theories or exams, but in the subtle terrain of emotion, pride, and social expectation. Padma Patil's night at the Yule Ball serves as one such moment, a quiet unravelling of what should have been a graceful evening for a clever girl. Instead, it became a lesson in how intelligence sometimes bows to passivity. Padma Patil had always lived slightly in the shadow of her sister Parvati, who belonged to Gryffindor and whose bold personality often attracted attention. Padma, though no less graceful or bright, carried herself with the quiet composure often found among Ravenclaws. She was well-read, observant, and expected to glide through social occasions with the same ease she displayed in the classroom. The Yule Ball, one of the few events at Hogwarts that allowed students to engage outside their academic roles, promised a rare evening of delight and excitement. For Padma, It was not merely a ball, it was a moment to step into the light and enjoy herself. When she accepted Ron Weasley's invitation, though he was clearly her second choice after the more desirable and confident boys had already been taken, it was with the hope that the evening would at least be pleasant. Ron, though awkward, was known for being kind-hearted. Perhaps she even thought she could enjoy witty banter with his famed best friend, Harry Potter. She arrived at the ball looking radiant in bright turquoise robes, her dark hair twisted up with delicate silver accents, embodying every bit of elegance one might expect from a young witch of her standing. But the night veered off course almost immediately. Padma's date, Ron, showed up in second-hand robes that smelled faintly of mothballs and looked as though they hadn't seen a fitting charm in decades. Worse than his appearance was his attitude. Ron was not present, at least not emotionally. His eyes, tinged with jealousy and confusion, followed Hermione Granger all night, who had arrived on the arm of Victor Krum, the famous Bulgarian Quidditch star and Durmstrang champion. Padma, left to the side as Ron sulked and brooded, attempted to salvage the night. She tried engaging him in conversation, gently nudging him toward the dance floor, but each attempt was met with distracted monosyllables or outright silence. Ron was staring at Hermione like a lovesick Kneazle, Parvati would later recall, with a mixture of irritation and pity. Padma's disappointment grew more visible as the evening wore on, her posture stiffening, her smile fading. Here, in this moment, we see the curious failure of a Ravenclaw. For all her intelligence, Padma remained seated beside a boy who clearly wished to be somewhere else. She could have risen, excused herself, and found another partner, perhaps one of the Beauxbatons boys, many of whom were actively circulating the room and looking for conversation. She could have returned to her sister, who was dancing and laughing with other Gryffindors. She could have even withdrawn gracefully and joined the professors as a statement of quiet dignity. But she did none of these things. Padma stayed. She sat through one awkward dance and returned to the table, where Ron muttered bitter complaints about Hermione under his breath. This was not the evening she had envisioned. It was not what she deserved. Yet for some reason, be it politeness, discomfort, or uncertainty, she lingered. A Ravenclaw with sharper instincts, perhaps even Luna Lovegood, would have floated away from such a scene without a second thought. But Padma, despite her house's reputation, clung to the moment, hoping, perhaps, that it would shift. As the music swelled around her and other couples twirled in candlelight, Padma found herself in a lonely space, her turquoise robes catching reflections of the enchanted ceiling, but no longer feeling magical. Intelligence alone could not lift her from her seat. Emotional strength, self-worth, and the courage to walk away, these were the qualities required at that moment, and they did not come. In Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, the narration paints a quiet but telling picture. Padma was looking sulky and bored. It is a simple line, but it conveys everything. She was not dramatic, not furious, not confrontational. She was disappointed in silence, enduring an evening that had nothing left to offer her. That stoic endurance, while admirable in its restraint, was a failure of agency. Later in the evening, Parvati abandoned Ron to go dance with boys from Beauxbatons, unwilling to waste the night. Padma had the same option. No spell bound her to her seat, no charm prevented her from rising. But sometimes the weight of politeness and the fear of seeming impolite keeps people in places they no longer belong. Perhaps she feared looking foolish, perhaps she didn't want to draw attention, but her inaction was itself a statement, a surrender. This was not the first time that a Ravenclaw's intellect failed to translate into social confidence. The house is home to thinkers, philosophers, inventors, but not always to those who understand how to navigate the quiet cruelties of emotion. Padma's predicament wasn't unique to her. It was emblematic of a broader truth. Wisdom is not only the knowledge of facts, but the courage to act in accordance with one's value. That night, Padma did not act. She waited, hoping her date would become the boy he wasn't. The irony is piercing. A house famed for curiosity and inquiry should have prompted her to ask herself, "What am I doing here?" Yet she did not. She endured a fruitless evening beside someone emotionally absent, sacrificing her own joy in the name of social decorum. Was that truly intelligent? Or was it, in the simplest terms, unwise? Padma's choice that night did not define her whole character. She remained a skilled student and a thoughtful young witch, but the Yule Ball exposed a vulnerability, the assumption that cleverness alone is enough to navigate the world. In truth, there are arenas like the glittering Great Hall on a winter's night, where bravery, self-respect, and decisiveness matter more than logic or grades. What makes this moment particularly instructive is its ordinariness. It was not a grand battle or a duel of wands. It was a dance, a date, a failure of communication and action. In a castle full of magic and mystery, sometimes the most painful lessons are delivered not by dark wizards, but by disappointment in a blue dress beside a boy who doesn't look at you. Some might argue that Padma simply didn't want to cause a scene, that she remained out of kindness, not weakness, but kindness, when it comes at the expense of your own dignity, becomes martyrdom. A Ravenclaw's challenge is to balance logic with self-respect, and that night the scale tipped in favour of silence. Interestingly, Hermione, though not a Ravenclaw, demonstrated the sort of strength Padma lacked. Faced with Ron's bitter judgment and jealousy, Hermione walked into the ballroom confidently on Crumb's arm, danced, laughed, and made the most of the evening. She did not shrink to make others comfortable. Padma's passivity, contrasted with Hermione's defiance, illuminates the missed opportunity of the evening. Had Padma taken control of her own night, her story would have been different. Perhaps she'd have left with a new friend, a memory worth cherishing, or even just a sense of pride in having done something for herself. Instead, she left with a bitter taste of wasted time and the knowledge that she had sat through an evening that slowly unravelled her hopes. Even the most brilliant minds falter when emotions cloud judgment. That is not shameful, it is human. But in the world of Hogwarts, where every decision is magnified by the magic of youth and the sharpness of identity, these small missteps echo louder. The Yule Ball was not just a school dance, it was a trial, quiet and subtle, and Padma Patil, for all her intelligence, stumbled. No one mocked her for it, no one jeered, but perhaps that makes the moment even sadder. There was no explosion, no chaos, just a slow fading of hope beneath the floating candles. And Padma, who had the mind to analyze runes and the wit to argue charms theory, did not recognize the lesson until the moment had long passed. The story of that night remains a reminder that even Ravenclaws must learn to marry intellect with instinct. Wisdom is not just knowing the answer, it is knowing when to stand up, when to leave, and when to choose yourself. Padma did not fail as a student that night. She failed as a girl who forgot her worth. And perhaps that is the most human failure of all. Number 17, Orla Quirke, quitting Dumbledore's army over disagreements. In the flickering candlelight of the room of requirement, the faces of Hogwarts students glowed with anticipation and unspoken fear. Among them stood Orla Quirke, a Ravenclaw fifth year whose presence went largely unnoticed by most, overshadowed by louder voices and braver wands. Yet for a time she was there, standing shoulder to shoulder with Ginny Weasley, Neville Longbottom, and Luna Lovegood. She had chosen to be there, to learn defense against the dark arts under Harry Potter's guidance. Her robes were marked by the same fear of the looming shadow outside Hogwarts walls, the same recognition that Dolores Umbridge was poisoning the castle from within. But unlike many others, Orla did not stay. She left. And in that choice, she illuminated a paradox of her own house, a decision made with reason that defied wisdom. Ravenclaws are known for intellect, for asking questions others avoid, for skepticism that sharpens their minds. But there is a danger in too much distance, in becoming a spectator to one's own life. Orla had the advantage of being among the few students who recognized that something was gravely wrong with the Ministry's version of reality. She was not blind to the rise of Voldemort. She did not mock Harry's claims, nor did she snicker like Zacharias Smith when Harry described the night Cedric Diggory died. She came to the DA meetings in their early days, paying attention with quiet intensity. But there was something restrained in her commitment, as if she were auditing the revolution rather than joining it. When Orla stepped away from the Dumbledore's army, she did so without a dramatic exit or confrontation. She simply stopped coming. Hermione Granger, ever the tactician, noticed her absence first, but said little. There were others to train, and time was slipping like sand through their fingers. But to those who knew her, the absence of Orla was striking. She had been diligent, precise in her spell work, particularly skilled at nonverbal casting, a trait rare even among older students. Her departure was not due to fear or incompetence. It was a decision rooted in something else, an internal calculation that Harry's intensity had become unsettling, that his methods were not aligned with her personal compass. In Order of the Phoenix, the students' rebellion was not just a matter of skill, but of moral stance. "We're not learning how to defend ourselves, we're just learning theory," Hermione had said of Umbridge's curriculum. The DA was an act of resistance. Orla's refusal to continue was, in its own way, a form of resistance too, but one directed at Harry, not at Umbridge. She told a friend, according to Seamus Finnegan's recollection, that she thought Harry was more obsessed with revenge than actual defence. That statement, cold and analytical, might have seemed intellectually honest, but in truth it was short-sighted. Orla, in her Ravenclaw precision, mistook moral discomfort for strategic clarity. She believed that stepping back would preserve her neutrality. But there is no neutrality in war. When she left, she did so thinking she was choosing reason over emotion, detachment over hysteria. But in doing so, she left herself defenceless. Not long after, Katie Bell was cursed by a necklace meant for Dumbledore. Muggle-born students began disappearing. The walls of Hogwarts no longer kept the darkness out, and Orla, who could have stood wand to wand with her peers, was now a bystander to a struggle that demanded action. Her decision is rarely mentioned in fan discussions, overshadowed by the louder heroics of Harry and his closest allies. Yet Orla represents something important in the tapestry of Hogwarts, a quiet case of a Ravenclaw misjudging the moment. Her house prizes cleverness, but cleverness is not the same as courage. "Wit beyond measure is man's greatest treasure," says the diadem of Rowena Ravenclaw, but even the sharpest wit is dulled when fear disguises itself as prudence. After the Battle of the Department of Mysteries, when news of Sirius Black's death rippled through the school, Orla was seen in the library, red-eyed but silent. She did not return to DA meetings, though by then they were effectively disbanded. What passed through her mind then, regret, guilt, or quiet vindication, is lost to history. But her absence in that final confrontation, and in the months of training that preceded it, meant that her name would never be listed among those who fought back. Orla's decision stands in contrast to Luna Lovegood, a fellow Ravenclaw who did not hesitate to act despite being mocked and marginalized. Luna believed Harry not because of blind faith, but because she recognized truth when she saw it. She embraced the irrational, the intangible, and still chose the path of resistance. Orla, meanwhile, clung to rationality until it became a cage. She wanted evidence, control, a structured plan. The DA was messy, emotional, unpredictable. It frightened her. This is not to say Orla lacked intelligence. On the contrary, she was admired in her classes for her analytical essays and her gift for magical theory. Professor Flitwick once remarked that she had a natural inclination for the underlying structure of enchantments. But intelligence alone cannot prepare one for moral crossroads. When the time came to apply knowledge under pressure, she froze, not in fear, but in over-analysis. Tragedy of Orla is that her decision seemed wise at the time. Her reasoning was not irrational. Harry was aggressive. The meetings were secret, risky, and fueled by a mix of fear and anger. But revolutions are rarely tidy. Dumbledore's army was not about polished technique. It was about survival, and about teaching each other what the adults refused to. Orla, in distancing herself from what she saw as Harry's recklessness, also distanced herself from the truth. In their 5th year, students like Ginny and Neville bloomed under pressure, transforming from background characters into warriors. Orla remained static. Not because she lacked potential, but because she feared contamination by chaos. In a world unraveling at the seams, she chose stillness. Her choice reminds us that being clever does not mean being right. Later, when the Carrows took over Hogwarts in the 7th year, and students like Michael Corner and Terry Boot were tortured for defiance, Orla reportedly kept her head down. She was not a traitor. She did not report others, but she also did not resist. She was the kind of student who took notes while others took risks, and yet in the silence of her choices there echoes a kind of pain, a recognition, perhaps too late, that wisdom requires more than thought. It requires action. In the aftermath of Voldemort's defeat, names of the fallen were honored. Statues were raised. Students who had fought were remembered. Orla's name was not mentioned. She graduated quietly, moved into the Department of Magical Transportation, and specialized in portkey regulation. She led a life of quiet efficiency, respected by her colleagues, but rarely seen in public movements or reunions. Her story faded, not because it was unimportant, but because it was uncomfortable. Yet her story is crucial to understanding the complexities of Hogwarts houses. Not every Gryffindor is brave, not every Slytherin is cruel, and not every Ravenclaw makes wise decisions. Orla's arc reveals the danger of mistaking inaction for balance, of dressing fear in the robes of intellect. She did not betray anyone, but she did fail herself. She walked away from a moment that could have defined her, believing that silence would shield her. It didn't. Some say that Orla later taught at a smaller wizarding school in Ireland, where she emphasized the importance of independent thinking. She encouraged her students to question authority, to seek clarity in confusion. But she never spoke of her time at Hogwarts, not publicly, perhaps because it was too complicated, or perhaps because, deep down, she knew that her one great mistake had been a failure to trust her own instinct, that quiet voice that once told her something terrible was coming, and that no amount of distance could keep her safe from it. Her tale serves as a caution to those who pride themselves on intellect alone. Wisdom, in the end, is not what you know, but what you do with what you know. Orla Quirke, with all her potential, made the mistake of thinking that neutrality was noble. In truth, it was a gamble with the cost of preparation. In war, you don't get points for clarity if you've never drawn your wand. And somewhere in the room of requirement, long since sealed, perhaps her name still glows faintly on the old list Hermione enchanted, half erased, forgotten by history, but remembered by the very magic that once tried to teach her something action could never delay. Number 18, Tiberius Tugwood, refusing exams because he already knew everything. Tiberius Tugwood's name had once echoed through the halls of Ravenclaw Tower like that of a living legend. Even among the proud minds that had walked through its eagle-guarded door, he had stood out. Stories about him drifted down from upper years to first years like enchanted parchment passed from hand to hand. He was the boy who had corrected Professor Binns during a lecture on goblin rebellions, and had been right. He was the only student Flitwick had ever admitted had mastered the non-verbal countercharm before learning the incantation. And in the library it was said that Madame Pince once stopped to ask him if a text on obscure elemental transfiguration had been properly indexed. He had a mind that cut through magical theory like a blade through fog. Everyone agreed Tiberius Tugwood was brilliant. Yet brilliance has its own shadow, and for Tiberius it was the belief that intellect alone could carve a path through every obstacle. That certainty would one day become his undoing, for the very trait that brought him admiration from professors and jealousy from peers also led him down a path of quiet ruin. It began not with a scandal or a failed spell, but with a decision, a single declaration spoken without fanfare, but loud enough to be remembered. "I shall not sit for my Niwutees," he had announced as calmly as one might state the time. He was in his final year, having aced every theoretical exam in previous terms. But now, at the cusp of graduation, he turned away from the one ritual that defined success in the magical world. The staff were stunned. Professor McGonagall, then deputy headmistress, had approached him privately. Though records do not reveal what passed between them, it is widely believed she attempted to reason with him. She, too, had been a Ravenclaw once and knew the dangerous allure of mistaking intellect for infallibility. Tiberius, unmoved, held firm. "Exams," he insisted, "are designed to measure knowledge, but I measure knowledge daily with thought and invention. I am beyond proving anything in a written room." To his peers it seemed arrogant, but they couldn't deny his record. He had won the magical theoretical prize 3 years in a row, something no other student had done in over a century. He had been cited in a footnote of magical law and logic by Merton Graves, the esteemed scholar of legislative enchantments. When Professor Vector had introduced an advanced arithmancy proof in class, it had been Tiberius who suggested a simplification still used in Hogwarts today. How could such a person need exams? But the wizarding world, like any world, operates not just on brilliance but on proof, and in Tiberius's case the lack of formal qualifications became a heavy chain he applied to the Department of Mysteries, confident that his theories on the temporal elasticity of time-turners would earn him a place. But the unspeakables rejected him outright. He had no NEWTs. The Department of Magical Accidents and Catastrophes, where his proposed method for safer flu transport had drawn attention, likewise declined. Even the Experimental Charms Committee, known for taking eccentric minds, could not make an exception. What Tiberius had failed to grasp, what even Ravenclaws sometimes forget, is that intellect without humility becomes a form of blindness. He had imagined a world in which merit was self-evident, where one's worth could be seen by those wise enough to look. But institutions required more than genius. They required recognition, cooperation, and often bureaucracy. His refusal to bend to the system was viewed not as a mark of character, but as immaturity, or worse, insubordination. And so the most brilliant student Hogwarts had seen in a generation left its gates without a certificate, without a future, and without a plan. He returned to his family home in Kent, a crumbling stone manor filled with books and isolation. There he immersed himself in theory. He wrote over 600 pages on the magical properties of lunar eclipses, a work that remains unpublished. He attempted to construct his own version of a pensive, but lacking ministry certification, no one would fund him. The world had closed its doors. Some say he became bitter, others say he remained content, surrounded by runes and scrolls, convinced of his superiority. A former classmate, Clarissa Oakbridge, once visited him a decade after their graduation. She described a man who spoke in long-winded monologues about his potential, but who shrank at the mention of former classmates who had become successful auras, healers, and scholars. "He lives in a castle of thought," she wrote, "but it has no doors or windows." His case eventually became a cautionary tale in Hogwarts. Professor Flitwick once referenced him obliquely during a particularly challenging charms seminar. "Knowledge, my dears," he had said, "is like a wand, powerful but useless unless wielded, and even the strongest wand must sometimes pass inspection." It is unclear if Tiberius ever returned to the castle, but his portrait, unfinished and unframed, lies in the archives, half-sketched by a student who once hoped he would join the Ravenclaw Hall of Fame. His story resurfaced briefly when a young Ravenclaw named Elspeth Trimmings found one of his journals behind a false panel in the astronomy tower. The writing was meticulous, half in English, half in Latin, and filled with equations and theorems no one could entirely decipher. Yet scattered among the brilliants were bitter scribbles. "Let the ministry rot. My mind is my degree, and only fools need exams." Elspeth turned the journal into the library, where it was catalogued under eccentric manuscripts, author unrecognized. No plaque bears his name. The irony was cruel. Had Tiberius taken the exams, he would likely have scored higher than any in Hogwarts history. His mind was sharp enough to deconstruct entire systems of magic. He could describe in a sentence what others wrote essays to explain, but he lacked what some of the less brilliant possessed, the wisdom to play the game. He had misunderstood the purpose of ritual. Exams were not just evaluations, they were rites of passage, symbols of discipline, and acknowledgements of community standards. One of the few quotes attributed to him directly was recorded by a Hufflepuff named Bertie Marsh, who had served as a library assistant. "They want me to dance like a flobberworm for their amusement," Tiberius had said, "but I'm a phoenix, I don't crawl." The metaphor was poetic, but tragically misplaced. For, in choosing to soar alone, he burned his own wings. In the years that followed, his name faded. New prodigies emerged, students like Hermione Granger, whose brilliance was matched by relentless discipline, or Luna Lovegood, who paired creativity with empathy. The story of Tiberius was whispered only by older professors and buried in forgotten corners of the castle, his achievements eclipsed by his absence from the world's stage. Genius, after all, is not just about knowledge, it is about contribution. Ravenclaw House, for all its glory, is not immune to misjudgment. It prides itself on the pursuit of wisdom, but wisdom is more than intelligence. It is knowing when to speak and when to listen, when to challenge and when to comply. Tiberius had been a child of raw intellect, but not of grace. He had dissected spells, but not mastered his pride. And pride, as any witch or wizard knows, is one of the oldest curses. The saddest detail comes perhaps from the Hogwarts yearbook of 1931. Next to his name, under post-Hogwarts aspirations, Tiberius had written simply, "To teach the world how to think." It is not known whether he ever taught a single class. There is no record of his name in the rolls of any magical school, no lectures attributed to him, no apprentices. His brilliance became a private fire, illuminating only the walls of his study. Decades later, when the ministry published a list of lost magical thinkers, Tiberius was not mentioned. He had not registered any inventions. He had not participated in any duels or debates. He had left no recognized legacy. In a world where even minor wizards found a footnote in history, Tiberius Tugwood was a ghost, brilliant, burning, and forgotten. Some claim his work might still be found in obscure manuscripts, hidden in magical libraries too old to remember their catalogues. A rumor persists that the Department of Mysteries did eventually acquire his theories, uncredited, and used them in Time Turner restrictions post-1981, but if so, it was done without his name. His legacy is now a lesson, a caution scrawled between the lines of Ravenclaw wisdom: never mistake knowledge for impact, never confuse knowing with doing. In the end, Tiberius Tugwood serves not as a tragedy of intellect, but of character. He was the epitome of a Ravenclaw, unchecked, unchallenged, and unwise. His failure was not in lacking knowledge, but in refusing to stoop to share it. That refusal, more than any failed spell or mistaken theory, became the misstep that erased him from history's parchment. And it reminds us, painfully and clearly, that the sharpest quill is useless if never pressed to parchment. Number 19, Luna Lovegood, believing in the death-stopping powder of Marmmitans. Ravenclaws are known for their intelligence, logic, and pursuit of knowledge, but every once in a while, one of them makes a choice that seems to defy all the principles their house represents. Luna Lovegood, perhaps the most eccentric Ravenclaw to ever walk the halls of Hogwarts, offers a peculiar case study. Her belief in creatures few others acknowledge and her willingness to entertain ideas outside the realm of accepted magical theory mark her as an outlier, even in a house that supposedly treasures free thought. Yet there was one particular moment in her life that went beyond eccentricity into the territory of dangerous delusion, the incident of the Marmmitan powder. This wasn't just an innocent whim or another one of her father's fabrications published in the Quibbler. Luna herself later admitted to having tried the powder. It happened during the summer after her 5th year, in the days following the battle of the Department of Mysteries. The trauma of what had occurred in the Ministry, Sirius Black's death, the encounter with death itself in the form of the veil, left her shaken, though she rarely showed it. When she returned home, she spent days reading her father's archives, looking for forgotten truths. That's when she came upon an article he had never published, one that claimed the existence of a powdered magical substance extracted from the bones of Marmmitans, creatures unknown to any serious magizoologist. The article alleged that this powder, if ingested under moonlight and in the presence of thestrals, could temporarily prevent death. It wouldn't revive the dead, the theory stated, but it would render the user immune to dying for a short time. According to the supposed eyewitness account, it was tested centuries ago by a French alchemist named Julien de Fontaine, who claimed to have walked into a basilisk's chamber and survived unscathed. The story was preposterous on its face. There were no known creatures called Marmmitans, and de Fontaine wasn't mentioned in any reputable alchemical texts. Yet Luna took the article seriously. She began her own preparations. She gathered powdered beetle wings, tincture of belladonna, and ash from a yew wand. She even managed to acquire a scrap of thestral mane hair, which she had kept since 3rd year. When asked why she believed in such an obviously unfounded claim, she simply replied, "Not all knowledge is in books." This echoed her earlier comment to Harry, spoken with serenity. Things we lose have a way of coming back to us in the end, if not always in the way we expect. But there is a vast difference between poetic optimism and belief in unproven magic that borders on the hallucinatory. Despite her brilliance in subjects like potions and care of magical creatures, despite the raven on her uniform, Luna acted on the Marmmitan myth. She brewed the powder according to the directions in the article and consumed it on a moonlit night in her backyard, surrounded by thestrals she had coaxed with raw meat. She described the experience later in the Quibbler as floating between here and there, as if death had knocked but decided to wait. What she experienced, however, was not a brush with immortality, but likely the hallucinogenic effect of her own concoction. Magical analysis performed months later by Professor Slughorn, who was deeply concerned after reading the publication, revealed the mixture would cause temporary delusions of incorporeality and heightened confidence. This might explain why, only days after taking the powder, Luna attempted to enter the Forbidden Forest alone to investigate the paths between the living and the dead. She was found by Hagrid, unconscious and mildly poisoned. The core contradiction of the incident lies in the fact that Luna, though creative and intuitive, dismissed all evidence-based reasoning. Ravenclaws pride themselves on wit and wisdom. Rowena Ravenclaw's diadem bore the inscription, "Wit beyond measure is man's greatest treasure." Yet Luna's belief in Marmmitans and death-defying powders flies in the face of both wit and wisdom. In fact, one might argue it was dangerously close to foolishness. Professor Flitwick, her head of house, never commented on the matter publicly, but several staff members reportedly questioned whether Luna's eccentricity was masking a detachment from reality that needed addressing. This moment becomes even more complex when considering her own relationship with death. Luna lost her mother at the age of 9. She watched her die in a magical experiment gone wrong. Unlike Harry, who had no memory of his parents' deaths, Luna carried a vivid picture in her mind. Perhaps this shaped her desire to escape death, not through fear, but through curiosity and hope. The Marmmitan powder was not a bid for eternal life. It was, in her mind, an attempt to understand death, to meet it halfway. But understanding death, as Dumbledore once suggested, is the ultimate goal of the wise, and wisdom requires discernment, the ability to separate truth from delusion. In this respect, Luna faltered. Her actions were not those of a calculated thinker, but of a dreamer convinced her dreams were real. This is not to deny her bravery or her compassion, both of which she demonstrated many times, from the Battle of Hogwarts to comforting Harry on the loss of Sirius, but it does reveal a schism between her house's ideals and her own instincts. Other Ravenclaws, Cho Chang, Padma Patil, even Terry Boot, approached knowledge with academic rigor. Luna approached it with faith. That alone might not be cause for criticism, but faith without boundaries can lead to decisions that endanger oneself and others. The Marmmitan incident was harmless only because of sheer luck. Had the potion been slightly more toxic, had she gone further into the forest, or had a thestral reacted unpredictably, the story could have ended in tragedy. There's a haunting irony here. In believing she could shield herself from death, Luna came closer to it than ever before. And yet, even after the incident, she maintained that she had felt something real. In her words, it's possible that death is just an idea, and ideas change when we look at them the right way. This was classic Luna, mystical, poetic, infuriatingly vague. But it was not Ravenclaw logic. It's tempting to see Luna's act as symbolic. Perhaps to her it wasn't about escaping death, but confronting it on her terms. Still, that interpretation doesn't excuse the irrationality of her method. Ravenclaw students, especially in the upper years, are expected to conduct magical inquiry with caution, research, and evidence. What Luna practiced was more akin to magical spiritualism, something Professor McGonagall once called the dangerous cousin of divination. Her father, Xenophilius Lovegood, undoubtedly influenced her. A man willing to print stories about heliopaths and crumple-horned snorkax would certainly encourage his daughter to entertain untested magical ideas, but being raised in an environment where logic is constantly replaced by wonder may have stunted Luna's ability to differentiate between belief and reality. And that, in the end, is the heart of the matter. A Ravenclaw is not meant to discard wonder, but to harness it, test it, and transform it into truth. In the years following the war, Luna became a respected magizoologist. She eventually admitted during an academic conference in 2009 that she no longer believed in the Marmmitan powder. "We were grieving and looking for answers," she said. "Sometimes our hearts lead our heads." This rare moment of self-awareness suggested that Luna had matured into the Ravenclaw she was always meant to be. Imaginative, yes, but tempered by experience. Still, the Marmmitan incident remains a stain on her otherwise admirable record. It shows that even the wisest minds can be clouded by emotion, by longing, by the irresistible urge to make the world more magical than it truly is. Luna's choice to act on a fantasy, rather than to examine it, reminds us that Ravenclaws are not infallible. Intelligence is not immunity from error. In fact, some of the gravest mistakes are made not from ignorance, but from too much imagination. Perhaps it is this tension between logic and wonder that defines Luna best. She is not the average Ravenclaw, and perhaps she never was meant to be. But in the context of house values, her belief in the Marmmitan powder stands as a moment of failure. A failure not of character, but of reasoning. It teaches a sobering lesson that even within the House of Wisdom, the line between brilliance and absurdity is perilously thin. The story of Luna and the Marmmitan powder is now taught at Hogwarts in magical ethics, as an example of the dangers of unchecked belief. Her name is mentioned not with scorn, but with caution. Students are encouraged to question everything, even their own hopes. And perhaps that is the true Ravenclaw legacy. Not certainty, but the courage to challenge even the most beautiful lie. In this way, Luna's mistake has become part of the school's intellectual heritage. It stands beside the triumphs of great Ravenclaws like Ignatia Wildsmith or Perpetua Fancourt as a reminder that intelligence must be married to judgment. One without the other is not wisdom, but illusion. Luna Lovegood, the girl who saw what no one else could see, once believed she could touch death and survive. In trying, she almost lost herself, and for one fleeting night, the stars above the Lovegood home bore silent witness to the folly of a Ravenclaw who forgot to think. Number 20, Aunt Muriel criticizing Hermione as a match for Harry. At the heart of the magical world, where houses are known to shape destiny and define character, there comes a moment when even Ravenclaws, the wise, the clever, the thoughtful, act in contradiction to their very creed. Aunt Muriel, known formally as Muriel Prewett, stood as one such contradiction. Named by J.K. Rowling herself as a Ravenclaw, this elderly witch's behaviour during the wedding of Bill Weasley and Fleur Delacour pulled her far from the pedestal of wit and closer to the ground of prejudice and social arrogance. Her words, sharp and unfiltered, revealed a kind of intellect not clouded by confusion, but corrupted by social standing and outdated beliefs. The scene unfolds with the wedding of Bill and Fleur, a rare moment of joy and celebration during the dark days of Voldemort's return. The burrow, typically chaotic, had transformed into a glowing space full of magical decor and soft music. Witches and wizards from all walks of life gathered in unity. But among the joyful crowd, Aunt Muriel's presence was a stark reminder that not all judgments fade with time. She was over 100 years old, opinionated beyond measure, and known in the family for her sharp tongue and sharper opinions. She wore a goblin-made tiara to the event, later lent to Fleur as a wedding gift, but it was not this ancient heirloom that drew attention. It was the woman's tongue. Muriel targeted Hermione Granger, who had arrived at the wedding looking modest but elegant, arm in arm with Harry Potter. To many present, this pairing made perfect sense. They had stood side by side in battle, in classrooms, and in moments of despair. Their friendship was one of respect and deep trust. Yet Muriel, who claimed to see far beyond the surface, made her judgments not based on deeds or heart, but on bloodline and behaviour. "The Granger girl," she hissed to Elphias Doge, "is not what I'd call suitable. Too opinionated, far too forward." Her words were not whispered. They were delivered with the confidence of someone who believed their thoughts to be both unshakable and correct. These comments stand in stark contrast to what one would expect from a member of Ravenclaw House. The defining trait of Ravenclaw is wisdom, an admiration of learning, originality, and independent thought. Yet Muriel dismissed Hermione not for a lack of intelligence, but because she possessed too much of it, and more unforgivably dared to use it. Her disapproval wasn't born of logic or reasoning, but from an archaic ideal of what a young witch should be. Her critique, stating Hermione was too pushy, reeks of the very close-mindedness Ravenclaws are supposed to shun. For a house that once welcomed the likes of Luna Lovegood, quirky, brave, unfiltered in her beliefs, Muriel's comments were not only disappointing, but hypocritical. There is no denying Hermione Granger's brilliance. She was the top of her class, the brightest witch of her age, a girl who had brewed Polyjuice Potion in her second year and mastered a time-turner in her third. When Harry needed her most, she stood by him with reason, calmness, and wit. Muriel's remarks disregarded every achievement, reducing Hermione to a stereotype, the pushy Muggleborn, the loud know-it-all, and someone unfit for Harry not because of lack of connection, but due to societal prejudice. One might argue that age brings wisdom, but in Muriel's case, age had brought a sense of superiority, rooted not in learned truths, but inherited bias. It was the same tone used by those who whispered about Muggleborns in darker corners of the wizarding world. "Not quite our sort, dear," Muriel had once remarked about someone else in the family. It was always the same litmus test: blood status, etiquette, and conformity. Hermione passed none of those in Muriel's eyes, not because she lacked virtue, but because she dared to shine too brightly. The irony is painful. Muriel, with her legacy, her pedigree, her status as a Ravenclaw, should have recognized Hermione as the embodiment of everything Rowena Ravenclaw stood for. Instead, she saw in Hermione a threat to a world she was reluctant to see change, a world where girls like Hermione did not bow their heads or wait for permission to speak, a world where Muggle-borns rose through intellect, not lineage, and most of all, a world where Harry Potter, the boy who lived, could choose love and companionship based not on blood, but on heart and shared experience. Rowling never gave Muriel a moment of redemption. She remained unrepentant, smug, and unapologetic. That, too, was telling. Not all Ravenclaws use their wisdom for good. Some, like Gilderoy Lockhart, cloak their intellect in charm and lies. Others, like Aunt Muriel, distort it through the lens of aristocracy and tradition. Intelligence alone does not make a person wise. It is what one does with knowledge that defines them. There is an old quote by Rowena Ravenclaw engraved somewhere in Hogwarts. "Wit beyond measure is man's greatest treasure." But what happens when wit is used not to enlighten but to judge? When intellect serves not curiosity but confirmation bias? Muriel's treatment of Hermione revealed this darker side of cleverness, a side that is blind to compassion and deaf to change. Her statements weren't errors of logic but failures of heart, and yet in her mind they were absolute truths, sharpened over a century of unchecked opinion. Hermione, for her part, handled it with quiet grace. She never retaliated, never stooped to Muriel's level. Her silence was not weakness but strength. It was the strength of someone who had faced prejudice before, from Draco Malfoy's slurs to Rita Skeeter's lies, and survived with dignity intact. In that moment, Hermione embodied everything Ravenclaws should aspire to be: composed, rational, and unwavering in self-worth. Muriel, though a Ravenclaw by assignment, had long since surrendered the ideals of her house. What makes Muriel's case particularly fascinating is that her comments were not born from ignorance. She had likely heard of Hermione's exploits, knew of her achievements, and understood her importance in Harry's life. Yet despite all that, she chose to belittle her. That choice, the active denial of merit, was where intelligence failed. It wasn't a lack of knowledge that fueled Muriel's judgment, but an unwillingness to evolve. Her wisdom had grown old and brittle, no longer flexible, no longer inquisitive. Muriel's rejection of Hermione also mirrored a larger societal rift within the wizarding world. The war with Voldemort was not just a fight against evil, but a battle against hierarchical traditions. Blood purity, elitism, and the worship of pedigree. Muriel might not have shared Voldemort's methods, but she quietly supported the systems he sought to preserve. Her disapproval of Hermione wasn't violent, but it was poisonous. It whispered that intellect must come with pedigree, and that no matter how smart, a Muggle-born should know her place. This dissonance between house traits and personal behavior is not rare in the world of Hogwarts. But Muriel's case is unique because of her age and status. Her words carried weight not just because of what she said, but because of who she was. A respected elder, a witness to 100 years of magical history, her biases, when voiced, had the power to reinforce harmful norms. That is what made her lapse from Ravenclaw virtue not just a personal flaw, but a social danger. Harry, for his part, never responded to Muriel's comments, but the reader knows he treasured Hermione deeply. His trust in her was absolute. She had saved his life more times than he could count, had stood by him when others faltered. To Harry, she was family. And so the idea that she was somehow unworthy of him was absurd. It was an insult not only to Hermione, but to Harry himself. Muriel, with all her learning, failed to grasp the most basic truth. Love and loyalty are earned, not bestowed by bloodline. Even Fleur, who had once clashed with Hermione, had grown to respect her. Their journey from rivalry to solidarity during the Horcrux hunt showed maturity and growth. Fleur recognized Hermione's strength and bravery, but Muriel, she clung to first impressions, to old gossip, and to the rigid standards of a time long past. She wielded her words like a dueling wand, not to protect, but to wound. Her behavior also casts a shadow on the idea that Ravenclaws are inherently noble in thought. It reminds us that houses are not absolute. They are tendencies, not destinies. A Ravenclaw can be brilliant and cruel, just as a Slytherin can be ambitious and noble. Aunt Muriel's story is a warning that intellect, left unchecked by empathy, can become arrogance. That knowledge without kindness is incomplete. That the House of Wisdom is not immune to folly. One might wonder how Rowena Ravenclaw herself would have judged Muriel. Would she have seen in her a fallen student, corrupted by pride, or would she have blamed the world that let snobbery pass as insight? In either case, Muriel's disdain for Hermione stands as a misstep, a moment where cleverness bent into cruelty. When the war was over, when Voldemort had fallen, and the wizarding world began to heal, one hopes that people like Aunt Muriel learned something, that they saw how courage, friendship, and loyalty mattered more than ancestry or silence. But we are never told. Muriel fades into the background, her words lingering only as echoes in the reader's mind. And perhaps that is fitting, because sometimes the most dangerous ideas are not shouted from mountaintops but whispered behind teacups. Sometimes the greatest betrayal of wisdom is not a mistake made in ignorance, but a judgment made with certainty. Aunt Muriel was a Ravenclaw, but in her treatment of Hermione Granger she abandoned everything that title should have meant. Number 21. Gilderoy Lockhart, using a broken wand for memory magic. Gilderoy Lockhart had always been a contradiction. Draped in velvet cloaks, his smile as dazzling as a freshly polished trophy, he strutted through the halls of Hogwarts with the confidence of a man who had conquered dragons, vanquished banshees, and seduced sphinxes. His books, stacked neatly in flourish and blots, told tales of daring and brilliance. Parents adored him, and some students, particularly those who paid more attention to charm than substance, found him enthralling. But behind the pages of Magical Me and the showy bravado lay a truth too awkward to be whispered in the respectable corridors of Ravenclaw Tower. Lockhart was a fraud, and not just a harmless exaggerator, but a man who built his career upon memory charms and stolen glory. Yet nothing in his fabricated past quite prepares us for the moment his own lack of judgment betrayed not only his house's values, but also common sense. In the belly of Hogwarts, as Harry Potter and Ron Weasley confronted Lockhart in the second book, Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets, a culmination of arrogance, fear, and pure foolishness, unfolded. They found him packing his office, frantically, carelessly, like a man who had been caught mid-heist. Books lay scattered, portraits askew, and Lockhart's only response was to confess his intentions to run away. But the true unravelling began not when he tried to flee, but when he revealed the weapon of his escape plan, Ron's broken wand. It was an artifact that had already backfired countless times throughout the school year. Everyone, including first years and even Peeves the poltergeist, knew that Ron's wand was treacherous. It had a tendency to backfire, emit strange noises, and once caused Ron to belch slugs for hours. Yet Lockhart, a celebrated Ravenclaw, a house defined by intelligence and wisdom, grasped it like a sword of justice and aimed it at two boys who had already seen through his charade. That Lockhart chose Obliviate, a memory-erasing charm, is not surprising. It was his favourite trick, the very foundation of his fame, but to perform it with an unstable wand, one that visibly splintered and had been poorly repaired with spellotape, was a decision so stunningly reckless that it transcended arrogance and entered the realm of parody. He was gambling his only real skill on a tool unfit even for simple spells. The moment is immortalized in the book. The wand exploded with the force of a small bomb. Harry flung his arms over his head and ran for cover. Bits of wand, Lockhart and rock were blasted into the air. Chamber of Secrets, Chapter 16. The result wasn't just comedic, it was catastrophic. The spell rebounded, erasing Lockhart's own memory entirely. This wasn't a mistake born of inexperience. It was not the misfire of a young student who hadn't learned the rules of magic. It was a full-grown adult, a Ravenclaw alumnus, engaging in an act of such stupefying ineptitude that even the portraits of former professors must have shuddered in disbelief. Ravenclaws are known for learning, logic, and cleverness. They are the puzzle solvers, the book buriers, the riddlers and researchers. Helena Ravenclaw, daughter of Hogwarts' very founders, prized intelligence above all else. To think that Gilderoy Lockhart ever walked the same halls as her is to contemplate how far the name of a house can stretch before it snaps. One could argue that Lockhart's error was born of panic. Cornered, his secrets exposed, he clutched at the only means he had to escape without consequence. But panic does not excuse stupidity. Even in fear, a man with genuine intellectual reflexes would question whether a broken wand could safely carry out a memory spell, especially obliviate a charm requiring precision, control, and an undamaged channel for magical energy. There's irony in the fact that Lockhart had likely used this spell dozens, if not hundreds, of times before. It was his signature act. And yet when he needed it most, he sabotaged himself through blind confidence and utter lack of technical caution. What makes this moment more bitterly poetic is that Lockhart had always posed as an intellectual. He positioned himself as a scholar, weaving tales of magical prowess and intellectual superiority. He was a best-selling author, after all. He published not one, not two, but an entire series of books chronicling fictitious adventures. That required some degree of cunning, if not intellect. He knew how to manipulate perception, spin lies into legend, and cast memory charms with surgical precision. Yet when that veneer was stripped away, all that remained was a man who didn't understand the fundamental rule of spellcasting. The wand matters. No true Ravenclaw would have made this mistake. Even Luna Lovegood, often seen as dreamy and peculiar, demonstrated far more practical sense in her time at Hogwarts. She believed in things others dismissed, yes, but her grasp of magical logic and intuition was real. Professor Flitwick, the head of Ravenclaw House and a master of charms, would have been horrified. A wand is a wizard's most intimate magical companion. Its flaws are not trivial, they are dangerous, and Lockhart treated Ron's wand like a quill borrowed in haste, not a vital magical conduit. It's worth considering that Lockhart didn't lack intelligence entirely. His deception required planning and a certain brand of cunning, but intelligence, in the true Ravenclaw sense, is more than clever lies. It's curiosity, precision, and humility before knowledge. Lockhart had none of these. His knowledge was superficial. He never cared to learn magic deeply, only enough to steal credit for others' deeds. He performed memory charms not out of mastery, but out of necessity, and he likely never learned how they truly functioned. This lack of understanding is precisely what betrayed him. And yet perhaps the greatest betrayal was not of others, but of himself. Lockhart had built an empire on the belief that intellect could be faked. He wore the costume of a scholar, but never did the work. The moment he lifted that broken wand and pointed it at Harry and Ron, he declared his own ignorance louder than any confession ever could. A real Ravenclaw, even under pressure, would have stopped, paused, questioned the instrument in their hand, assessed the risk. Lockhart did none of this. The very act of trying to erase the memories of two students with a known faulty wand underlined Lockhart's complete detachment from practical magic. He had likely never fixed a wand, never attended a single lesson on wand lore, never read wand weaving through the ages. For someone who claimed to have taught yeti tracking and troll charming, he knew remarkably little about magical basics. He treated spell work as theatre, not science, and magic, especially memory charms, does not tolerate showmanship without structure. There's a grim humour to his downfall. A man who made a living erasing the identities of others lost his own in a heartbeat. The wand exploded, and with it, his entire manufactured life. He emerged from the rubble dazed, confused, his memories erased so thoroughly that even his own name became a question. Madame Pomfrey later remarked, "He seems to be quite content, though he absolutely insists that he is a famous wizard, but cannot remember what for." Chamber of Secrets, Chapter 18. In this line lies the bitter punchline. Even stripped of memory, Lockhart's ego remained intact. The implications of this moment ripple beyond comedy. Lockhart's action was not just a personal error, it was a failure of Hogwarts vetting, a reflection of how charisma can eclipse competence. He was placed in a position of authority over children, and yet he didn't understand how magic worked at its most basic level. His behavior could have seriously injured or even killed students. The blast of that spell collapsed part of the tunnel, nearly trapping Harry and Ron beneath tons of stone. And still, one cannot ignore the symbolic justice of it. In choosing a wand he didn't understand, in casting a spell he relied on too much, Lockhart sealed his fate. The spell turned inward, stripping away the lies, the polish, the fake signatures in his books. What remained was not a Ravenclaw, not a hero, not even a villain, but a hollow man, his mind as empty as the pages of his ghost-written adventures. It's a lesson in more than just magic. Lockhart's downfall reminds us that intellect without substance is dangerous, that pretending to understand is not the same as knowing, that cleverness without care leads not to success, but to implosion. He could have been a truly brilliant wizard had he chosen learning over illusion. Instead, he became a cautionary tale. Years later, when Hermione Granger visited him at St. Mungo's, she looked upon a man who once stood in her classroom, now signing photographs with a vacant smile. His memories never returned. He remained trapped in a cycle of imaginary fame, forever unaware that he had once stood on the edge of greatness and stepped backward. Gilderoy Lockhart's story is not just about a Ravenclaw who failed to live up to his house's ideals. It's about how intelligence must be rooted in humility. Wisdom is not in knowing everything, but in knowing what you don't know and respecting it. The broken wand was more than a plot device. It was a mirror reflecting the cracked core of a man who thought he could rewrite reality with lies. He was a man who loved to erase memories, but in the end, he became a man without one. And that, perhaps, is the most fitting and tragic ending of all. Number 22, Miles Bletchley, Spreading Misinformation from Misunderstood Gossip. Miles Bletchley had always been a curious anomaly at Hogwarts, known initially as the brutish Slytherin keeper with a perpetual scowl and a reputation for bending the rules on the Quidditch pitch. Few could have imagined that behind his stone-faced demeanour lurked an academic streak potent enough to warrant a quiet, controversial transfer to Ravenclaw during his later years. J.K. Rowling once noted in an interview that Bletchley, while deeply rooted in Slytherin ambition, had shown an unexpected aptitude for analytical charms and political theory, which led Professor Flitwick to champion his move to Ravenclaw. And yet in the end, that move served more to highlight the stark difference between knowledge and wisdom than to elevate his reputation. It was in his 7th year, during a particularly tense winter term, that Bletchley made the critical mistake that would turn him into a cautionary tale whispered about in Ravenclaw Tower. The Ministry of Magic was in upheaval again, debates over educational policy, rumours of sweeping changes to standardized magical testing, and whispers about new enforcement protocols were trickling into Hogwarts. Bletchley, ever the opportunist, saw the climate as ripe for influence. He had taken to lurking outside staff rooms, eavesdropping in corridors, and even using a modified extendable ear, Charmed, with a complex silencing loop, allegedly of his own design. He overheard a conversation between Professor McGonagall and Professor Sinistra, muffled through the stone walls of the North Tower corridor. The professors, concerned about a potential ministry decree that would introduce Auror-administered educational oversight, was speculating on contingency plans. "If they follow through with this nonsense," McGonagall said, "we'll be forced to cancel the examination schedule and re-evaluate our entire curriculum." The words were careful, measured, and hypothetical. Sinistra had responded, "There's no way Fudge would approve of evacuating the students unless the threat became tangible." To any truly observant Ravenclaw, it was a brainstorming session filled with conditionals and cautious academic planning, but Miles, in all his eagerness to be the first to know and the first to share, missed the nuance. He bolted to the great hall, where a group of fifth-year Ravenclaws were gathered around a game of wizard chess. With breathless authority, he announced that the professors had confirmed the cancellation of all exams and that the school was preparing for immediate evacuation. McGonagall said it herself, he insisted, quoting the line with all context stripped away. By lunch, the rumours had spread. Hufflepuff students began hurriedly writing letters to their families. Gryffindors speculated about possible attacks. A group of Slytherins, smug and sceptical, claimed it was just another one of Bletchley's strategic panic plays. And within the serene walls of Ravenclaw Tower, opinion was split. Some praised Miles for being ahead of the curve. Others muttered that even Rowena Ravenclaw would cringe at his lack of basic inference. As Cho Chang put it to Marietta Edgecomb later that day, "It's not clever to listen if you don't understand what you're hearing." The chaos escalated when a group of sixth-year students confronted Professor Sprout about the supposed evacuation. "What evacuation?" she had asked, flabbergasted. In the ensuing investigation, it quickly became clear that Bletchley had started the rumour. When questioned by Flitwick, he defended himself by pointing to the exact words he had heard. "She said we'll be forced to cancel exams," he repeated, as if the literalism absolved him from any responsibility for misinterpretation. But the flaw lay not in his ears, but in his mind. For all his academic growth, Bletchley had failed the essential Ravenclaw principle, understanding. Intelligence was not measured in how much you knew, but in how well you could process, assess, and apply it. It wasn't enough to gather data. You had to weigh it, understand its context, and foresee its impact. The incident prompted Flitwick to issue a quiet warning to the rest of Ravenclaw House. "There's brilliance," he reportedly told a group of seventh years during a mentoring session, "and then there's wisdom. The former fills the mind, the latter guides the soul." It was the sort of quote that stuck with people, especially those who had seen firsthand what happened when cleverness became reckless. Ravenclaws took pride in their pursuit of knowledge, but there had always been an unspoken rule about humility. True intelligence, Rowena herself had once taught, was in knowing that you don't know everything. Bletchley, despite his talents, had never truly grasped that. His version of smart was performative, facts recited without context, gossip parroted as gospel, and speculation passed off as certainty. In the weeks that followed, Hogwarts struggled to regain a sense of calm. The incident had exposed how volatile student morale could be and how quickly misinformation could undermine authority. Even the Daily Prophet ran a small article about it, though they stopped short of naming the student responsible. Those who knew, however, didn't forget. Bletchley himself became more withdrawn. Gone was the smugness with which he had once quoted ministry policy. He stopped using his charmed, extendable ear and avoided conversations about school politics. Rumour had it that he spent hours in the library poring over logical theory and political rhetoric, perhaps in an effort to understand where he had gone wrong. But knowledge acquired in shame seldom blooms into wisdom. Bletchley graduated with decent marks, even and exceeds expectations in defence against the dark arts, yet he was never mentioned in Ravenclaw alumni circles. His name was associated less with intellect and more with caution. Years later, a Ravenclaw prefect reportedly told a new first-year, "Don't be a Bletchley, listen closely, but think deeper." The irony was not lost on those who remembered his past. Bletchley, who had transferred to Ravenclaw in pursuit of truth, had become a living example of how truth could be twisted when filtered through assumption and ego. There was no spell for understanding, no incantation for insight. It required discipline, reflection, and above all, patience, traits Bletchley had failed to cultivate. It's easy to mistake sharpness for depth. Many Ravenclaws excel in riddles and ancient runes, in arithmancy and charms. But the House of the Wise also teaches restraint, the quiet art of interpretation. One must consider not only what is said, but how and why. In this, Bletchley had faltered, and that falter rippled through Hogwarts like a tremor beneath the surface of calm. Years later, when Flitwick retired, he was asked in an interview what lesson he believed every Ravenclaw should learn. "It is not how much you hear," he replied, "but how much you understand. A mind can be full and still be blind." Those who studied the case of Miles Bletchley as part of Hogwarts' internal review noted that it was a rare example of intellectual failure, not born from ignorance, but from arrogance. He had the facts, he had the tools, and he had the ambition, but he lacked the interpretive grace that true intelligence demanded. In truth, there was something tragic in Bletchley's story. He wanted to matter, to be remembered for his sharp mind, not just for blocking goals or sneering at Gryffindors, but in trying to leap ahead of the narrative, he lost control of it entirely. He became, as some whispered with dry wit, the Ravenclaw who cried wolf. The example remains etched in Hogwarts' memory not because of the scale of the fallout, but because of the lesson it taught. Intelligence without wisdom is like a wand without a master, dangerous, aimless, and bound to backfire. And thus, the house that bore him did not deny his presence, but it did not celebrate it either. His portrait was never hung, his name not etched into the list of honoured alumni. His legacy, instead, was a whispered reminder passed between students leaning over parchment and candlelight. Listen, yes, but always, always think. Number 23, Ella Bland, burning a rare book, mistaken for a fake. In the cold stillness of a midwinter afternoon at Hogwarts, the flicker of greenish flame in an unused classroom would go unnoticed by most. But in the world of ancient magic, every flame carries memory. Every spark tells a story. And on that particular day, it told the story of Ella Bland, a Ravenclaw student whose brilliance had never before been questioned until she made a mistake so irreparable that even the ghosts of Hogwarts whispered about it. Ella had always stood out among her peers, not for her robes, though she kept them immaculate, or her voice, which rarely rose above a whisper, but for the unrelenting way her mind chased knowledge. She was often seen crouched in the farthest corners of the library, copying runes by candlelight, translating forgotten incantations from the margins of dusty texts no one else dared touch. Her fascination lay in archaeous charms, spells predating the formation of the modern Ministry of Magic. Ella believed that in those long-lost incantations were secrets that could restore magic to its purest, most potent form. So when a parcel arrived by owl one icy morning in February, unmarked, bound in oiled parchment, and sealed with a symbol she recognized from her research on pre-Enlightenment magical societies, Ella trembled. Inside was a book that practically hummed with magic. The title embossed on the cover was Transmutations of the Hollow Tongue, a volume she had once read about in Modern Magical Discoveries, lost and found by Bathilda Bagshot. Only 5 copies were ever confirmed, and all were thought to be held under lock and key in the Department of Mysteries. She spent the entire weekend analyzing the text. The pages were brittle, almost translucent. The ink faded into a strange iridescent sheen that shimmered differently under candlelight than it did in daylight. Every instinct told her this was real. Every logical deduction pointed to authenticity. But logic, as the professors so often warned, is only as good as the facts it's based on, and Ella's facts were incomplete. It began with a discrepancy. Page 63 mentioned a ritual called the Circle of Voiceless Fire, which in her previous readings was described in entirely different terms. In Runes Beyond Reason, Professor Wylona Talbot's controversial thesis, the ritual was said to require 5 casters. You can see this book claimed 3. Ella's faith began to crumble. She remembered Professor Flitwick once muttering, "There is no room for vanity in ancient magic. If you assume you're always right, you are precisely when you're most wrong." But Ella didn't pause to revisit that idea. She burned the book the next day. The fire she conjured wasn't ordinary. It was spelled to eradicate every magical trace, to prevent even a skilled unspeakable from reconstructing the charred remains. A spell from burnings in the age of dark books, a textbook banned in most institutions, except Hogwarts, where knowledge was valued above censorship. She whispered the incantation with a steady hand, and as the flames consumed the parchment, the room filled with a scent not of ash, but of lavender and myrrh, a scent tied to preservation rituals, not counterfeits. The following week, Professor Vector noticed her missing from arithmancy. When she found Ella in the library staring hollow-eyed at the bindings of new books, she asked if everything was all right. Ella confessed, not in words, but by sliding a piece of parchment across the desk, a diagram she had copied before destroying the book. Professor Vector went pale. "Ella, do you understand what you've done?" she said, and pulled the parchment toward her, as though the symbols might vanish again. That diagram, it turned out, was unmistakably authentic, a binding circle used in the old tongue, known only to a handful of magical historians. It had been presumed lost after the fire in the Department of Mysteries during the Great Registry Purge. Soon the whispers began. Ravenclaws sat in quiet corners, speaking her name not with malice, but with confusion. How could Ella Bland, top marks in magical theory, the girl who wrote a 15-foot essay on the inconsistencies in Cassia Wobble's chronomantic structures of the 8th century, have made such a novice error? The answer was pride. Not arrogance in the Gryffindor sense, nor ambition in the Slytherin flavour, but the quieter, more insidious pride of certainty. Ella had believed herself too clever to be fooled, and it was that belief that led her to skip the final test. The verification runes, a harmless charm designed to authenticate enchanted ink. "Knowledge without humility," said Professor Babbling, when asked about the incident, "is like fire without a hearth. It consumes everything, including the one who lit it." She made the statement during a lecture on magical calligraphy, but everyone knew it was meant for Ella. Even Hufflepuffs, usually the last to gossip, were discussing the event in hushed tones near the kitchens. "It's not like her," said Megan Wellow, a 6th year. "She's the cleverest one among them. If even she could mistake a real text for a fake, what hope do the rest of us have?" The head of Ravenclaw House, Professor Phileas Flitwick, took a gentler stance. During a closed-door meeting with Ella, he placed the broken pieces of a shattered wand on the table. "This belonged to my dueling partner in the 1970s, he told her. "He was as skilled as they came, but in one match he misjudged a feint, just one, and it cost him more than just the duel." He gestured to the wand. "No one is above error, Ella, but the error becomes tragedy when it teaches us nothing." Ella asked if the book could be restored. Flitwick shook his head. "Some magics are designed to erase, not destroy. You used one." It was Professor Sinistra who noticed the deeper tragedy. The spells in the book were not merely historical. They were part of a larger cycle of enchantments used in protective wards during the Goblin uprisings. If those wards had been rediscovered, they might have helped shield magical locations now exposed by rising dark activity. "You didn't just lose knowledge," she wrote in her report to the Board of Magical Archives. "You potentially cost lives." For the remainder of the year, Ella kept mostly to herself. Her place in class was still near the front, her essays still brilliant, But her eyes had changed. She no longer wrote in margins with abandon. Every idea now came with a question mark, every assumption a second opinion. The Wizarding Times ran a brief editorial on the event, titled "The Fragility of Wisdom." It didn't name Ella, but the message was clear. Even Ravenclaws are not immune to folly. And when intellect marries haste, the child is ruin. What the article didn't mention was how Ella began rebuilding herself from that ruin, not in grand gestures but in quiet moments. She started a preservation circle in the Ravenclaw common room, inviting students from all houses to help replicate and secure magical texts before they faded into obscurity. She even wrote a letter to the Department of Mysteries confessing what she had done and offering the diagram she'd copied, along with every memory she could conjure from that weekend. A reply came months later. "We commend your honesty and your initiative. A mistake, yes, but not one without redemption. Knowledge, when reclaimed, is doubly valuable." One night, sitting by the enchanted windows that mirrored the stars outside, Ella overheard a first year asking another, "Is it true she burned the most powerful spellbook in the world?" She didn't correct them. Instead, she smiled, not out of pride, but out of understanding, because she knew now what every true Ravenclaw eventually learns, that intelligence is not immunity from failure, that brilliance, unchecked, can blind, and that the pursuit of wisdom is not about being right, but about knowing when you might be wrong. She never again cast a spell without first casting doubt. And in that, she became the wisest of them all. Number 24, Ambrosia Furnace, guessing riddle answers instead of solving them. In her third year at Hogwarts, Ambrosia Furnace was already infamous among the Ravenclaws for her unusual approach to the riddles guarding the entrance to their common room. It wasn't that she lacked intelligence. On the contrary, Ambrosia had once brewed a perfect draught of living death in Professor Slughorn's class, earning a rare approving nod from the potions master himself. But logic puzzles, she had no patience for them. Where others saw an opportunity to test their wit, Ambrosia saw an obstacle, a nuisance designed to slow her down. Her frustration grew with every new riddle that blocked her path to a warm chair and her favourite window seat in the common room. Unlike her peers who relished the mental challenge, Ambrosia sought shortcuts. She began compiling a personal notebook, not of answers to specific riddles, that would be too reasonable, but of stock phrases, generic answers she hoped might fit a variety of questions. Time, shadow, love, knowledge, concepts vague enough to appear in multiple riddles. She reasoned that since riddles were philosophical, repeating the great abstractions might yield a win. Her success rate was dismal. Still she persisted, convinced that persistence would outmatch precision. One cold November evening, she stood outside the Ravenclaw door, facing an iron eagle with inlaid sapphire eyes. "What is something that belongs to you, but others use it more than you do?" the knocker intoned. Ambrosia, already weary from a long day of classes, responded without thought. "Time," she muttered. Silence. Shadow. Nothing. The wind? The door remained firmly closed. She tried the future, then ambition, hope, and even unicorn. After 8 more fruitless guesses, she cursed under her breath and kicked the bottom of the door with her boot. Behind her, a group of first years gathered, clutching their books and scarves. One of them, a tiny boy named Lysander Privet, stepped forward and said, "Your name?" The eagle bowed its head, the door creaked open, and Ambrosia stormed past them, cheeks burning. That night she scratched "your name" into her notebook with more force than necessary. It was the 5th entry that week. Ambrosia's peers began to notice a pattern. She was often seen lingering by the door at odd hours, muttering potential answers under her breath like incantations. Some days she got lucky. Other days she waited for others to arrive and solve the riddle for her. "They're not riddles," she would snap, when questioned. "They're word traps, and they don't make any logical sense." The idea that Ravenclaw, while riddles were meant to test flexibility of thought, not just pure reasoning, never seemed to settle well with her. In class, Ambrosia excelled. She could quote arithmancy theories from memory and dissect ancient runes with finesse. Professor Flitwick once told her that she had the mind of a charm master. But in front of the Ravenclaw door, stripped of textbooks and formulas, she was often powerless. The contradiction between her academic brilliance and her failure at the riddles became a subject of quiet amusement among her peers. "The brightest witch of the year defeated by a talking door," they'd whisper. She developed rituals to disguise her struggle. She began arriving at the tower well before curfew, hoping to avoid an audience if she got stuck. She'd lean casually against the banister, pretending to admire the moonlight on the lake, while quietly hoping someone would join her. Occasionally, she made up stories about helping others with homework in the corridor, her way of explaining why she was still loitering outside the common room long after dinner. Once, during an evening storm, the riddle was particularly abstract. "What can bring back the dead, make us weep, make us smile, make us young?" Ambrosia sighed. "Time," she said again. No response. "Music, dreams, memory, tears." Her voice grew sharper with each guess. The wind howled through the windows as she added, "Love, sorrow, echoes." None sufficed. Finally, a second-year girl named Imani Wu approached and offered the correct answer. A memory. The door opened. Ambrosia didn't thank her. She simply pushed past and disappeared up the spiral staircase, her boots leaving muddy prints on the stone. Later, Imani would remark that she'd never seen a Ravenclaw so thoroughly detest being proven wrong. The problem wasn't that Ambrosia lacked the capacity for insight. It was her relationship with uncertainty. In her world, answers came from study, from mastery, from repetition. The idea of standing still and contemplating a metaphor until its essence revealed itself seemed wasteful to her. "I don't have time for this poetic nonsense," she told her dormmate Celine one night. "I'd rather solve 12 one-mechanics equations than guess what a doorknob thinks about truth." Despite her growing reliance on others, Ambrosia never abandoned her notebook. It grew thick with ink-blotted pages, organized by theme, answers involving light, answers about life, answers with paradoxes. She even added a color-coded system to track the frequency of certain answers. "If one of these shows up 3 times," she said, "it's statistically more likely to be useful again." Her roommates didn't argue, but they stopped walking to the common room with her. The professors remained unaware of her predicament, though Professor Vector once hinted that Ambrosia's need for control might be limiting her in less quantifiable disciplines. In a transfiguration essay, Ambrosia had tried to mathematically justify wand movements, ignoring entirely the emotional intention that McGonagall had emphasized. "Miss Furnace," the professor had scribbled in red ink, "not all truths are symmetrical, not all transformations are measurable." In her 6th year, Ambrosia's disdain for the riddles reached its peak. She argued during a heated lunch in the Great Hall that the common room should have a password like Gryffindor. "At least that's fair," she said. "It's static. It respects your memory, not your mood." When another student pointed out that Ravenclaws valued creativity, not predictability, Ambrosia rolled her eyes and muttered, "Then why even bother teaching logic?" It was during her final year that Ambrosia's approach began to catch up with her. One evening she returned from the library in tears. The riddle had been short. What can be cracked, made, told, and played? She tried every answer in her book. Nothing fit. After 15 minutes, a group of 3rd years arrived and, after brief discussion, said a joke. The door opened. Ambrosia didn't follow them. She sat on the staircase, staring at her notebook. It dawned on her then, her strategy wasn't cleverness, it was evasion. She'd spent years trying to beat the system rather than understand it. She hadn't failed Ravenclaw's ideals because she wasn't smart. She had failed because she treated intelligence as a weapon, not a curiosity. That night, she didn't write a joke in her notebook. She tore the page out entirely. In its place, she scribbled a question to herself. What am I afraid of when I don't know the answer? It remained unanswered. Years later, long after graduation, Ambrosia returned to Hogwarts as a guest speaker. She had become a renowned expert in spell linguistics, known for her breakthrough work in verbal constructs and magical semiotics. Yet when she passed by the Ravenclaw Tower, she paused. A seventh year greeted her, hesitated, and said, "There's a riddle. Want to try?" Ambrosia smiled. "Let's hear it." The eagle knocker asked, "What flies forever, rests never?" She closed her eyes, thought for a moment, not about concepts, but about rhythm, about truth. She saw the patterns, the poetry. She whispered, "The wind." The door swung open. Ambrosia didn't walk in. She simply nodded and turned away, the corners of her mouth lifting slightly. She no longer needed entry. She had already arrived somewhere far more important. In the Ravenclaw common room, her name remained on the wall of academic honours. But among the students, a new story emerged, not about her brilliance, but about the girl who had once tried to cheat riddles and eventually learned to listen. "It's not just about being right," said Imani Wu years later, recalling that stormy night. "It's about being present. Ambrosia taught me that even if she didn't mean to." In Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, Luna Lovegood tells Harry, "Things we lose have a way of coming back to us in the end, if not always in the way we expect." Though Luna never knew Ambrosia Furnace, she might have approved of how this Ravenclaw finally found her answer, not through guessing, but by growing. Number 25, Laura Moon, starting a gnome revolution in the Hogwarts kitchen. In her 5th year at Hogwarts, Laura Moon, a Ravenclaw known less for quiet study and more for her flair for the dramatic, decided she'd had enough of the systemic injustices woven into the very fabric of the wizarding world. She had recently finished reading Hogwarts, a history for the 3rd time, not out of reverence, but to mark all the ways in which the text glossed over, or worse, excused, the indentured servitude of house elves. "They like working," the book claimed. Laura had scoffed aloud in the library, earning a sharp glance from Madame Pince. "They like working," Laura had repeated to herself with venom. So did the house elves who served the Malfoys, I suppose. The tipping point came late one evening in the Ravenclaw common room. A conversation between two prefects, Marietta Edgecomb and Callum Goldsmith, had wandered into the topic of food preparation, and Callum, without thinking, referred to the house elves as part of the furniture. Laura's eyes narrowed. In that moment she felt the cold satisfaction of a plan beginning to bloom. If the elves wouldn't stand for their own freedom, and she'd already asked Winky, who had tearfully refused, then perhaps someone else could march in their stead. Garden gnomes were not by any means ideal allies, but Laura's logic followed a jagged path that felt in her gut irrefutably correct. Gnomes, after all, were oppressed. No one spoke to them, no one asked their names. They were flung, spun, and exorcised from gardens like pests. "Sentient creatures with no representation," she muttered in the margins of her herbology notes. The more she thought about it, the more the gnomes seemed like the perfect symbol for her campaign. If she could organize them, give them a voice, a banner, perhaps even little uniforms, they might represent all the silenced lives in the castle's hidden machinery. So began Operation Silver Ladle. She named it after a story her grandmother used to tell her about a ghostly cook who led a kitchen uprising using nothing but a soup spoon and courage. The plan was simple in theory, absurd in execution. She would retrieve garden gnomes from the periphery of Hagrid's pumpkin patch, gnomes who had survived numerous Weasley denomings and were, by some twisted miracle, still thriving, and smuggle them into the castle. Once inside, she would train them. Not in magic, obviously, but in movement, cohesion, and slogans. She began crafting tiny placards from popsicle sticks and parchment. One read, "Kitchens need justice," another, "Gnome more oppression." Retrieving the gnomes was far from elegant. She wore a knit cap that obscured most of her face and carried a pillowcase under one arm. It took several evenings and one unfortunate run-in with Fang to gather a total of 8 gnomes, whom she kept in a disused broom cupboard near the 4th-floor corridor. She fed them bits of carrot and pumpkin skin and played them audio recordings of her speeches using a magically modified quick quotes quill. Her Ravenclaw friends assumed she was working on an arithmancy project and wisely did not inquire further. The night before the march, Laura painted a crude banner that read, "Let the elves speak." She pinned it to the inside of her cloak and rehearsed her speech under her breath while brushing her teeth. "Brothers and sisters," it began, "I speak today not as a student, but as a witness to silent suffering." She practiced delivering it with fire in her eyes, imagining the applause that would echo through the great hall once the truth was finally spoken. She imagined Professor McGonagall standing at the edge of the hall, arms crossed, but her eyes glistening with admiration. She imagined Headmistress Flitwick whispering, "That girl has vision." None of this, of course, came to pass. The first thing that went wrong was the gnomes' refusal to march in unison. Laura had hoped for a neat phalanx of determined faces, but instead she had 8 snarling, jittery creatures darting in every direction the moment she opened the broom cupboard. She tried to corral them with a levitation charm, but it only caused one gnome to rise, scream, and vomit mid-air. Undeterred, she waved her banner and led the way toward the great hall, where breakfast had just begun. "Now!" she cried. "For dignity! For the unheard!" The gnomes surged forward, not toward the hall, but toward the smell of bacon. The chaos that ensued would later be described by third-year Eloise Midgen as the most terrifying breakfast of my life. Plates flew, sausages were hurled. One gnome latched onto a Slytherin first-year's ankle and refused to let go for a full 7 minutes, despite the combined efforts of 4 prefects and a Hufflepuff with a loaf of stale bread. Another gnome found its way into the pantry and tore open sacks of flour, causing a white haze to settle over the entire hall like a fog of war. Professor Longbottom arrived just in time to slip on a pat of butter and land, groaning beside the marmalade station. Professor McGonagall stood frozen at the entrance, lips pressed so tightly they turned a peculiar shade of purple. "Miss Moon," she finally said, once the gnomes had been rounded up, with considerable difficulty and the loss of 2 teaspoons. "What in Merlin's name have you done?" Laura stood amidst the wreckage, clutching her now torn banner, eyes wild with the kind of conviction that cannot be reasoned with. "I was trying," she said, "to bring justice." Flitwick, who arrived just as a gnome bit through a tub of margarine, took one look at the situation and emitted a sound that could only be described as a cross between a giggle and a sigh. "Well," he said softly, "that's a Ravenclaw brain if I've ever seen one. Brilliant and utterly impractical." The punishment was not as severe as it might have been. Laura received a 2-week ban from Hogsmeade, 50 points docked from Ravenclaw, and a formal letter placed in her file. But the real blow came from the house elves themselves, who, upon hearing of the attempted liberation, presented Laura with a neatly folded tea towel embroidered with the words, "We like it here." It was meant as a peace offering, but Laura took it as a betrayal. "Stockholm Syndrome," she muttered darkly. Retreating to the library to write a 30-foot essay on the philosophy of unwilling servitude. For weeks after, whispers followed her in the corridors. Students would glance at her and smirk, and someone charmed a gnome figurine to shout "Revolution" every time she passed the charms classroom. But Laura didn't regret it, Not entirely. She'd learned something essential about the world. Sometimes, even when your logic feels flawless, even when your intentions are noble, the outcome is chaos. Brilliance without wisdom, she wrote in her diary, the curse of the idealist. She found an unlikely ally in Luna Lovegood, who wrote her a letter from abroad after hearing of the debacle through her father's network at the Quibbler. "Sometimes you need a little madness to shake things up," Luna wrote. "I once tried to unionize the Nargles, but they wouldn't commit to a schedule. Still, you were brave." Laura pinned the letter above her bed. It became a reminder, not of failure, but of courage misunderstood. The story lived on, not just as a cautionary tale about Ravenclaw misjudgment, but as an emblem of Hogwarts' endless capacity for absurdity. Even Professor Binns mentioned it once, dryly noting during a lecture, "The only known rebellion of the Hogwarts kitchens was quelled not by force, but by snacks." Years later, when Laura returned to Hogwarts as a guest speaker during a Careers in Magical Advocacy seminar, she began her talk with a slide that showed a blurry photograph of a gnome covered in flour and triumphantly holding a spoon. "Let me tell you," she said with a smile, "about the time I nearly liberated the kitchen using creatures who don't even like wearing trousers." The students roared with laughter, but a few leaned forward, fascinated. Laura saw in their faces the same burning question that had once driven her. What if the system is wrong? She ended her talk with a single sentence. "Don't be afraid of ridiculous ideas. They're often the beginning of important ones." No one forgot the Great Gnome Uprising of 2005, not because it was logical or successful or particularly noble, but because it captured something uniquely Ravenclaw, a dazzling intellect wrapped around a heart that still dared to dream.